He gave up his first-class seat to a stranger. She left behind more than gratitude. One letter revealed the past he thought was gone forever, and a baby brought it all full circle. Welcome back, dear friends. If you've ever found yourself waiting at a gate, watching strangers come and go with stories you'll never know, this one might stay with you for a while. Today's story will touch your heart, challenge your perceptions, and maybe even bring a tear to your eye. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments, especially if an airport ever changed your life too. The Atlanta airport buzzed like a restless beehive that early Tuesday morning, a mixture of echoing announcements, rolling luggage wheels, and lives in motion. Amid the crowd at Gate B14 sat a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 60s, his posture dignified, his gaze calm but distant. His name was Walter Jenkins. Walter wore a crisp navy suit, leather shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a tie his late wife once gave him on their anniversary. Dark red with a subtle golden trim. It was his lucky tie, or maybe it was just a reminder of her. He clutched his first-class boarding pass in one hand, and in the other a worn leather wallet with a photograph that had nearly faded with time. His wife, pregnant, smiling in a summer dress. Walter wasn't flying for business or vacation. He was flying to New York for something much quieter. A visit to an old friend, a cemetery plot, a promise he had yet to fulfill. Just then, a commotion near the check-in desk caught his attention. A young woman, maybe late 20s or early 30s, struggled to steady herself. She was heavily pregnant, perhaps in her third trimester, clutching her lower back with one hand and a crumpled boarding pass in the other. Her clothes were plain, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked exhausted, anxious, and alone. Passengers glanced at her, then quickly looked away. She wasn't loud or dramatic, but something about her, maybe the way she kept looking around, as if she were hiding from someone, left a strange tension in the air. Walter watched as she slowly made her way to a seat near the gate. She let out a sigh that sounded too heavy for someone her age. He leaned forward slightly, his instincts stirred. Not pity, Walter didn't believe in that. No, this was something else. A feeling he hadn't had in years, like a whisper from long ago. When boarding was called for first-class passengers, Walter stood slowly, gathered his briefcase, and stepped forward. The young woman struggled to rise, nearly dropping her boarding pass. Economy boarding group 8. Back of the plane, Walter looked at her again, then down at his own ticket. Row 1A, window seat. Comfort, privacy, legroom. The kind of seat his wife always dreamed of experiencing, just once. He walked over to the woman and gently cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I noticed you're having a tough time. Would you like to trade seats with me?" She blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" "I've got a first-class ticket," he said, handing it toward her. "I think you could use it more than I could today." The woman stared at the ticket like it was a golden key. I can't accept that, sir. Really, I couldn't." Walter smiled gently. "You can, and you should. Consider it. A little kindness. We all need one now and then." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know what to say," he nodded. "Just say yes." A pause, and then trembling slightly, she reached for the ticket. Thank you so much." Walter escorted her toward the gate, handed his ticket to the attendant, and received hers in return. Row 34B, middle seat, no overhead space, and somehow it felt right. As she boarded first, Walter watched her walk down the jet bridge, clutching the first-class ticket with both hands like it was a lifeline. The moment felt strangely sacred. Back at Gate B14, life moved on. Announcements continued. People grumbled about delays, but for one brief moment, something extraordinary had happened. A man gave up comfort for compassion, and he had no idea what she was about to do next. The narrow aisle of the plane was already filling with tired travelers, dragging overstuffed bags and dodging elbows, muttering about overhead bins and tight seats. The young, pregnant woman, now holding Walter's first-class ticket, moved slowly but with a new kind of grace, like someone who had just been seen after being invisible for too long. Her name was Emily. No one on the plane knew that yet. Not the flight attendants who smiled politely, not the passengers who stared, and certainly not Walter, who had just handed her a piece of his past without knowing it. As Emily stepped into the first-class cabin, there was a moment of hesitation, like she didn't belong there. The soft leather seats, the quiet hum, the clinking of glasses, it all felt like another world. She had spent the last year hiding, running, surviving. First class? That wasn't for people like her. "May I help you find your seat?" a flight attendant asked kindly. Emily nodded. "1A?" The attendant smiled. "Right this way. You'll be very comfortable there." She slid into the seat carefully, one hand instinctively on her belly. The baby kicked, just a small flutter, and she whispered, "We made it." Her eyes scanned the cabin. Everything looked clean, peaceful, distant from the chaos she'd left behind. She noticed a small linen pillow, a warm blanket folded neatly, and then a handwritten note card on the tray. It said, "Welcome to First Class 1A. If there's anything you need, just ask. We're honored to have you with us." She almost laughed. Honored. If only they knew. Down in row 34B, Walter folded himself into the cramped middle seat. On either side of him were two younger men in business attire, both too focused on their phones to notice the quiet man in the suit. Walter didn't mind. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to remember. He looked out the window and thought of Margaret. She had never flown first class. She always said it wasn't necessary. "We fly with love. That's all we need." But Walter remembered how she used to linger at the gate, watching those first-class passengers board with their fancy bags and quiet confidence. He had promised her one day she'd sit in seat 1A. And now, in some strange, poetic twist, a stranger was sitting there instead, a stranger with something in her eyes that reminded him of her, of fear, of strength, of something unfinished. Back in seat 1A, Emily took out a pen and a crumpled piece of stationery from her purse. She began to write. Her hands shook slightly, not from the turbulence but from the weight of the moment. She wrote quickly, in small, slanted letters, as though every word was both a confession and a goodbye. When she finished, she folded the note carefully and slid it into an envelope. She stared at it for a long moment, then motioned to a passing flight attendant. "Would you do me a favor?" she asked quietly. "Could you give this to the man who gave me his seat after we land? Not before. Please." The flight attendant nodded. "Of course." Emily smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides 1,000 storms. Then she leaned back, rested her head against the window, and closed her eyes. She didn't know if she'd ever see that man again. She didn't even know his name, but she had something to give him, something more than thanks. Down in 34B, Walter closed his eyes too, unaware that an envelope with his future was now sealed above him, traveling 30,000 feet in silence. The engines roared louder, the cabin lights dimmed, and somewhere between Atlanta and New York, two lives, once strangers, began to intertwine. Not by chance, by something else. The hum of the jet engines had settled into a low, steady rhythm, a kind of airborne heartbeat. The first-class cabin was dimmed, peaceful, cocooned in its own rarefied silence. But in seat 1A, Emily's heart was far from calm. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the curve of her belly. Her fingers tapped gently, rhythmically, as if calming the child within, or herself. Though her body was still, her mind was spinning. With every mile, she was leaving behind a life she didn't choose. A marriage built on fear, a home that had become a prison. And yet, running wasn't what haunted her the most. What haunted her was the possibility that she had waited too long to escape. A soft chime broke the quiet as the flight attendant returned, kneeling discreetly beside her. "Is everything all right, ma'am? Can I bring you anything?" Emily shook her head with a gentle smile. "No, thank you. Just water." The attendant nodded and disappeared. Emily let out a slow breath, reaching into the small satchel at her feet. Inside was a single photograph, dog-eared and slightly torn at the corner. It showed two girls, barefoot, maybe 9 or 10, laughing under a willow tree. One of them was Emily. The other was someone she hadn't seen in more than a decade. Her half-sister. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Emily had planned to return with strength, with answers, with her life in order. Not like a fugitive, fleeing into the sky, carrying only fear and a half-formed prayer. She took out the envelope she had written earlier and turned it over in her hand. It felt heavier now, not physically, emotionally. It held more than just words. It held truth, and truth, she knew, could either heal or destroy. Her eyes drifted to the small screen beside her seat. Flight map, altitude, time remaining 1 hour, 47 minutes. Just enough time to rehearse everything she would say, if she ever got the chance to say it. Back in row 34B, Walter couldn't sleep. His knees ached. His shoulders felt tight. But the discomfort wasn't just physical. His thoughts kept circling the young woman he'd given his seat to. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something about her felt familiar. He pulled out his wallet and looked at the photo of Margaret again. She had been radiant in that summer light, hand on her belly, her laughter frozen in time. They had lost the baby 5 months later, and with it, something else had died between them. They never spoke of it again. Not really. Walter had lived a long life since then, built a career, made peace with grief, but some regrets never really aged. They just sat quietly in the corners of your soul, waiting for moments like this. He sighed, rubbed his tired eyes, and leaned back. Maybe giving up his seat had been more than kindness. Maybe it was something his soul had needed to do. A gesture, finally completed, after all these years. In 1A, Emily reached for the flight attendant again. "I'm sorry," she said. "Can I change the instructions about the letter?" The woman tilted her head kindly. "Of course. Please give it to him, but only if he asks for it. I don't want to force this on him." The attendant nodded, sensing the weight behind the request. "I understand." Emily leaned back, eyes closed, lips silently forming the same 4 words over and over again. "Please let this be right." The plane continued cutting through clouds, unknowingly carrying more than passengers. It carried secrets, grief, redemption, and a fragile thread between two strangers who had no idea how much they were about to change each other's lives. The hum of the engines faded into background noise, like a lullaby that no longer comforted. Emily sat in 1A with her eyes open, but her gaze was distant, fixed on something far beyond the clouds outside her window. She could still feel the envelope in her purse, sealed, quiet, patient. It was just paper and ink, but to her, it felt like a ticking clock. The truth inside that letter was the only thing she had left to give. She reached into her bag again, her fingers brushing over the envelope. It was worn at the edges already, not from age, but from hesitation. This wasn't just a thank you note, this was a confession, a bridge, maybe even a lifeline. She pressed the call button softly. A moment later, the flight attendant returned. "Changed your mind again?" the woman asked with a warm smile. Emily nodded. "Yes, but this time I think it's right." She handed her the envelope, holding it a moment longer before letting go. "Please give this to the man who gave me his seat. but only after we land, and only if he seems open to it. If he's closed off, or in a rush, or anything like that, just let it be." The attendant looked at her for a long moment. There was a quiet wisdom in her eyes, the kind that only came from watching thousands of people pass through moments of quiet desperation at 30,000 feet. "I'll use my best judgment," she said softly. Emily gave a faint nod. "Thank you." The attendant tucked the envelope into her apron pocket and moved on. Emily turned back to the window. The clouds looked like frozen waves now, white, endless, drifting beneath her like a sea of second chances. In row 34B, Walter stirred. The young man beside him had finally stopped typing. The passenger on the other side had drifted into sleep, snoring softly. Walter sat there in the middle, feeling more alone than he had in years. He reached into his coat pocket and felt for his watch. An old Hamilton, passed down from his father. The inscription on the back was fading, but he knew it by heart. Time reveals all things. He glanced around the cabin. No one was talking, no laughter, just blinking seatbelt signs and half-hearted movie screens glowing in the dark. He thought again of the young woman in 1A. He didn't know her name, but something in her eyes had spoken to him. Something urgent, wounded, yet strong. And something else. A look he hadn't seen since Margaret was alive. Not in the last years of their marriage, when silence filled the spaces where love used to live, but before, when she had hope in her eyes, before the hospital room, before the stillness, before they both gave up trying. He shifted in his seat. A strange unease settled in his chest, not fear, not regret, something closer to anticipation, like a page was about to turn, like a moment long overdue was quietly circling back to him. In 1A, Emily ran a hand down her stomach. The baby moved gently beneath her fingers. She whispered, "You'll be safe. I promise." It was the first promise she'd made in months that she believed she could keep. When the landing gear lowered and the pilot's voice crackled overhead, the spell began to break. Seatbacks clicked upright, belts snapped into place, bags were tucked under seats with nervous precision. As the plane descended toward New York, Emily leaned forward and glanced back down the aisle. Row 34. She caught sight of him. He was sitting quietly, his suit slightly wrinkled now, his face lined with stories he hadn't told. And for the briefest second, he looked directly at her. Their eyes met. She didn't smile. He didn't blink. Just a look. Long enough to say everything, short enough to vanish without explanation. And then the wheels touched down. A new chapter began. Even before the tires kissed the runway, something had shifted inside Walter. It wasn't just turbulence, it was memory. As the plane slowed, passengers around him reached for their belongings, stretching, complaining, texting loved ones. But Walter stayed still. His eyes were fixed ahead, toward a seat he couldn't see, and a woman he didn't know, but somehow couldn't stop thinking about. The moment their eyes met had struck him like thunder. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. There was something urgent in her expression, familiar, haunting, like a ghost from a life he thought he'd buried long ago. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the plane fade beneath the sound of her look, and suddenly he was somewhere else. It was 1998. Margaret had just found out she was pregnant after years of trying. Walter remembered how she danced in the living room barefoot, spinning with joy, holding the test stick like it was a magic wand. He remembered how he wept when he heard the heartbeat for the first time. And he remembered, just as vividly, the hospital room 6 months later. Cold, white, sterile. The silence that followed the doctor's words, the way Margaret's hand felt so small in his, her face so still, staring at the ceiling as if she'd floated far above the pain. He never got to meet his child. They never gave the baby a name. After that day, they stopped dancing. They tried to move forward, but it was like walking through water. Thick, heavy, and eventually they drifted apart, not with bitterness, but with quiet resignation. Margaret passed a few years ago, a peaceful end to a life marked by too much silence. Walter had lived alone ever since, filling his days with order, routine, and small kindnesses that made no headlines. But today had cracked something open. The young woman's eyes in seat 1A. There had been grief in them, yes, but something else too. A kind of defiance, like she wasn't just surviving, she was choosing to begin again. And Walter knew that look, because once, just once, he'd seen it in the mirror. He shifted in his seat as the plane taxied to the gate. People were already standing, grabbing bags they couldn't reach, pushing forward with the quiet desperation of travelers who had somewhere to be. But Walter stayed seated, lost in the noise of the past. His mind swirled with the idea of fate, coincidence, timing. Why her? Why today? Why did she look at me like that? His hand went instinctively to the inside of his jacket, brushing over the leather of his wallet, feeling for the photograph of Margaret. He didn't take it out. He just needed to feel it there, still with him, still a part of him. When he finally stood, he moved slowly, not from age, but from something heavier, the weight of meaning. He retrieved his bag, adjusted his coat, and waited for the aisle to clear. By the time he reached the front of the plane, she was gone. No glimpse, no goodbye, just a faint perfume in the air, soft and floral, like wildflowers after rain. He stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge. Cold air rushed over him, sharp and clean. He paused, then behind him a voice. "Sir?" He turned. It was the flight attendant, the same one who had been watching over seat 1A. She held out an envelope. "She asked me to give this to you, but only if you seemed open to it." Walter stared at the envelope. No name, just a small, almost invisible crease across the top. "She didn't leave a return address," the woman added gently. "Just said it was important, and that you'd understand." Walter took the envelope. He didn't speak, just nodded. As he walked down the terminal, the envelope pulsed in his hand like a secret finally ready to be told. And in his chest, something long dormant stirred. He didn't know it yet, but that letter would lead him somewhere he never thought he'd go again. Not just back into the past, but forward into something he thought was lost forever. Walter moved through the terminal like a man underwater, each step slow, deliberate, heavy with thought. The envelope remained clenched in his left hand, the paper slightly damp now from the sweat of his palm. Around him, travelers rushed past, wheeling suitcases, hugging loved ones, talking into phones. Life moved fast at JFK, but Walter walked in silence, the noise around him muffled by the storm inside. He found an empty bench near a window that overlooked the tarmac. Planes came and went, disappearing into clouds, appearing from nowhere. Just like people, just like stories. He sat down, exhaled, and looked at the envelope again. No name, no return address, just cream-colored stationery with a faint scent. Lavender, maybe. Something soft, familiar. He hesitated. He'd received plenty of letters in his life, some with good news, some that changed everything, but this one felt different. It felt like it had been traveling toward him for decades. Finally, he slid a finger under the flap and broke the seal. The letter inside was handwritten, the penmanship neat, careful, deliberate. There were no wasted words. "To the man who gave me more than a seat, you don't know me. At least I don't think you do. But I know you. When I was a child, my mother told me stories about a man who tried to help her when no one else would. She said he met her once, a long time ago, when she was scared and alone. She didn't take his help then. She was too proud, too angry, too lost. She said his name was Walter. She told me he had kind eyes. My mother passed away when I was 16. I never forgot that story. Years later, when I found myself walking through the same darkness she once did, I remembered the man she'd described. I prayed I'd meet someone like him. And today, I think I did. You gave me your seat without asking anything in return. You didn't know my name. You didn't know what I was running from, but somehow you knew I needed space to breathe, to believe, to begin again. I don't know what you've lost, Mr. Jenkins, but I saw it in your eyes, and I want you to know what you did today. It wasn't small, it was everything. I don't expect to see you again, but I needed you to know. The baby I carry will know your name and the kindness you gave her mother when we needed it most. Thank you. Emily Walter's eyes blurred with tears before he reached the end. He folded the letter slowly, as if touching something sacred, and rested it in his lap. Emily. The name echoed through him like a hymn. He looked out the window. A plane was lifting off the runway, rising small at first, then gliding higher, breaking through the low clouds, vanishing into the sky. He didn't know where she was now. He didn't know if she'd ever return. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just sorrow, hope, a thread connecting past to present, a promise he hadn't made, but had somehow kept. For a long time, he just sat there, eyes closed, the envelope resting against his chest like a heartbeat. Then he stood, carefully slipped the letter back into his coat pocket and walked toward baggage claim. Not with the slow weight of a man grieving, but with the steady pace of someone who had just been given a second chance. He didn't know what was coming next, but he was ready to find out. Walter sat alone in his hotel room that evening, the letter lying open on the small writing desk by the window. The city buzzed faintly outside, headlights flickering on wet streets, voices rising and falling in the distance like waves breaking far from shore. He had read it 3 times already, each time the words carved deeper into his chest. He turned the envelope over again, looking for something, an address, a phone number, anything, but there was nothing, just his name in careful script and the faintest trace of her perfume. Emily. It wasn't just her kindness that stayed with him, it was what she said about her mother. That her mother had once known him, that her mother had told stories about a man named Walter with kind eyes, a man who offered help, but was turned away. Walter stood slowly and crossed the room to the small suitcase on the bed. He unzipped it and pulled out an old folder, something he hadn't looked at in years. Inside were a few photographs, yellowed with age, and a single folded document, a hospital report from 1998. He didn't need to read it. He remembered every line. But beneath it, tucked in the back, was something else. A photo he hadn't seen in decades. A younger Walter and Margaret, taken just a week before they lost the baby. Margaret stood barefoot in the garden, her belly round, the sun lighting up her auburn hair. And beside her, another woman. A girl, really. 16, maybe 17. Eyes too old for her face. Her name came back to him like a distant thunderclap. April. She had lived in their neighborhood. A runaway. Margaret had taken her in for a few weeks when she saw her sleeping on a bench near the church. Walter remembered the arguments, the fear. April had been pregnant too. But she disappeared one night without warning. No note, no trace. Margaret cried for days. She never spoke of April again. And now here he was, reading a letter from April's daughter. Emily wasn't just a stranger. She was the daughter of a girl Margaret had tried to save and failed. Walter sat down hard, his legs trembling under the weight of it. What were the odds? What force had brought Emily into that airport, into that flight, into his seat? Was this coincidence or something more? He reached again for the letter and read the last line aloud, his voice cracking. "The baby I carry will know your name." He pressed the paper to his chest and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he prayed, not for forgiveness, but for a way to do something right, to carry the story forward, to finish what Margaret had started. Walter stood and looked at himself in the mirror. Older now, yes, but still standing, still breathing, still capable of choosing grace over regret. And now he knew what he had to do. He would find her. He would find Emily, not for closure, but for a beginning. The next morning, Walter sat at a small cafe near the East River, nursing a black coffee that had long since gone cold. In front of him lay the old folder he had brought from Atlanta, worn, creased, and filled with memories that had refused to stay buried. He reached inside and pulled out the faded photo again. It was the only image he had of April. She was barefoot in Margaret's garden, her hand resting cautiously on her stomach, as if even then she wasn't sure she deserved to carry life. Her face, so young, so tired, was turned slightly away from the camera, but her eyes were unmistakable. Walter held the photo beside Emily's letter and studied the memory against the truth. The resemblance was undeniable. The curve of the jaw, the same determined eyes. Even the way Emily had held herself when she walked, strong, guarded, like someone who had learned early not to expect softness from the world. They were mother and daughter, without a doubt. And suddenly, Walter saw the letter not just as a thank you, but as a bridge, a silent thread connecting a moment of failure to a moment of redemption. He remembered April's last day at the house. She'd been afraid of the system, of being controlled, of trusting anyone. He had offered to help, to take her to a clinic, to find her a safe place. But she refused. She ran. And now, 27 years later, her daughter had unknowingly walked into his life and sat where April never had the chance to. Walter leaned back and looked out at the river, the wind cold against the glass. His heart ached with the weight of it all, what had been lost and what had somehow been returned. But something else pressed at him now. A memory, not just of April, but of a name. Margaret had whispered it once, long after April had left. She said if it was a girl, she'd name her Emily. He hadn't thought of it then, hadn't realized she meant April was carrying a daughter, or that she had spoken it aloud, Emily. And now, here she was. He reached again for the envelope. Inside was something else he hadn't noticed before. Tucked into the back corner was a small Polaroid photo. It must have been slipped in without his knowing. Walter held it up. In the image, Emily stood on a porch, visibly pregnant, holding a folded baby blanket in one hand. Her other arm was wrapped around an elderly woman in a wheelchair, both of them smiling. There was no note, no date. But on the back of the photo, in the same handwriting as the letter, were 3 words. Her name's April. Walter's breath caught. Emily wasn't just remembering her mother. She was honoring her. She was giving her child the name of the woman who'd once disappeared into the night, frightened and alone. And somehow, through pain and silence and decades of distance, the circle had found its way back to him. He stared at the photo until the edges blurred. Then he slipped it back into the envelope and stood up. It was time not to chase, but to wait, to return to the place where all of this had started. The place where chance had offered him one more opportunity to be the man Margaret always believed he could be. Gate B14, Atlanta. Walter stepped off the escalator at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Gate B14 was just ahead, unchanged from the day everything had shifted. But today, it felt different. He moved slowly, not with the burden of age, but with the weight of anticipation. The letter, the photograph, the name, all of it had led him back here, not because he was sure she would be here again. He wasn't, but some part of him believed that if fate had crossed their paths once, maybe it wasn't done yet. He sat in the same seat he had that morning, weeks ago. The one where he'd first seen Emily holding her stomach, eyes darting with fear, strength hidden beneath fatigue. The memory was sharp, as if it had happened hours ago. Now, Gate B14 buzzed with life again. People coming and going, children crying, the smell of coffee and jet fuel in the air. A woman nearby complained about a delay. A teenager watched a movie on her phone with the volume too high. Walter barely noticed. He scanned every face, not with desperation, but with quiet hope. And then, when he had almost surrendered to stillness, he saw her. She came into view slowly, stepping out from behind a pillar, her hair tied up, her belly gone. In her arms, she cradled a newborn. Walter stood, breath stolen from his chest. She spotted him instantly, as if she'd known he'd be there. Their eyes met again. No rush, no shock, just recognition, as if the world had waited for this moment to catch up. Emily walked toward him, swaying gently with each step, the baby tucked close in a yellow blanket. Walter's eyes filled with tears before he could stop them. He didn't care. This wasn't a moment for pride. It was a moment for everything else. They stood facing one another for a breathless beat. Then she spoke, softly. "You came back." "I had to," Walter replied, voice cracking. "I wasn't done." Emily smiled, tears in her eyes. "Neither was I." She looked down at the infant, then gently shifted her arms, as if offering not just the child, but something far deeper. "Would you like to meet her?" Walter nodded, speechless. Emily handed him the baby, her hands steady, her trust complete. He took the child carefully, holding her like a sacred flame. Her eyes were closed, mouth slightly open, breath warm and sweet against his neck. Walter closed his eyes and let the moment soak through him. The child stirred gently in his arms. "What's her name?" he whispered. Emily wiped her eyes and whispered, "April." And there it was, full circle. Not just a name, but a memory reborn. A woman lost, honored. A child found, cherished. Walter held baby April a little closer and looked up at Emily. "She'll know everything," he said. "I'll make sure of it." Emily smiled. "I know." And then, for the first time in decades, Walter felt peace. Not because he had found something he was missing, but because something missing had found him. The sun was beginning to set over the tarmac, casting long golden rays through the windows of Gate B14. Walter remained seated, baby April still in his arms, her tiny chest rising and falling against the rhythm of his heart. Emily sat beside him now, their shoulders almost touching, but not quite. No words passed between them for several minutes. There was no need. Everything that mattered had already been said, in a letter, a photograph, a name. Walter rocked gently, instinctively, his large hands cradling the newborn with surprising tenderness. He'd never held his own child. But somehow, in this moment, it didn't feel like something new. It felt like something returned. "She's peaceful," he said at last, barely above a whisper. Emily smiled. "She knows she's safe." There was a pause. Then she added, "So do I." Walter glanced at her, the lines in his face softening. Emily looked different now, lighter, not just because she was no longer pregnant, but because she was no longer carrying fear. Her shoulders had dropped, her eyes were clearer. She had survived. And more than that, she was beginning again. "I didn't think I'd ever come back to this place," she said. "But something told me, maybe you would." Walter chuckled softly. "Something told me the same." Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a second envelope, smaller, unopened. She handed it to him. "She left this," she said. "My mother, April. She wrote it when she was pregnant with me, and she asked my grandmother to give it to me when I turned 18. I never read it. I wasn't ready. Walter took the envelope gently, holding it like a relic. On the front, in faded ink, "To my daughter, when the time is right." "I think maybe the time is right now," Emily said. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed with time. "My sweet girl, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into the woman I always hoped you'd be. I'm sorry I couldn't give you the life you deserved from the start. I was scared, and I ran. But I want you to know this. Once, long ago, someone tried to help me. A kind man and his wife. I was too broken to accept it. But I never forgot him. If you ever meet a man named Walter Jenkins, look into his eyes. If he still has the same heart, trust him. He's one of the good ones." April Walter's hands trembled. He pressed the letter to his lips. "I should have done more," he whispered. Emily touched his arm. "You're doing it now." Outside, another plane lifted into the sky. Inside, something deeper had taken flight. Walter stood, gently handing baby April back to her mother. Emily took her with practiced ease. "Come with us," she said. Walter blinked. "To where?" "Wherever we're going," she smiled. "We'll figure it out." And he knew, right then, that his life wasn't winding down. It was beginning again. A second chance, wrapped in a yellow blanket. As they walked away from gate B14, Walter beside Emily, Emily cradling April. It didn't feel like a farewell. It felt like home. Some seats are just seats, but some become bridges between lives. Walter gave up a seat and gained something far greater: purpose, connection, and a piece of the family he never thought he'd have. How many of us have sat beside a stranger, never knowing the story unfolding beside us? Would you give up your comfort for someone else's miracle? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a life-changing moment in an airport? Tell us below. If this story touched you, please consider clicking the super thanks to support more beautiful stories like this. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a moment that might just change your heart. And don't leave just yet. Tap the next story on your screen. It's one you won't forget.